Welcome to this explainer. If you are a UPSC aspirant, you're probably losing sleep over this exact topic right now. Today, we're breaking down a massive, high-stakes constitutional puzzle. We're going to dive into this rapidly evolving OBC Creamy Layer crisis, exactly what the Supreme Court recently ruled, and how it literally threatens to upend the civil services selection process. We are sticking strictly to the concrete legal facts and the government's own petitions to make sense of this massive shift. So, let's just jump right in. Okay, picture this scenario for a second. You've got your OBC non-creamy layer certificate in hand. Your parents aren't senior government officers, but let's say your dad works in the private sector and his salary just recently crossed the old income cutoff. Prelims are literally right around the corner. Or maybe your rank is already out and you're thinking, great, I'm safe, and then boom. News breaks that the government is rushing back to the Supreme Court asking for urgent clarity, practically begging to protect the 2025 and 2026 exam cycles. The absolute burning question on your mind right now is, wait, is my certificate still valid? Did a recent judgment just completely change the rules of the game while we were already playing it?
All right, part one, the creamy layer crisis and these mid-game rule changes. To really get this, we have to look at the structural shift that happened almost overnight. For literally 2 decades, following the 2004 rules from the Department of Personnel and Training, or the DOPT, things were evaluated very differently depending on where your parents worked. If you were the kid of a senior government officer, you were labeled creamy layer, based purely on your parents' status, no matter what their exact paycheck looked like. But if you were the child of a private sector manager, a bank employee, or someone in a PSU, you were tested primarily against a strict family income ceiling. Historically, that ceiling sat around 8 lakh rupees. That was the old standard. Well, fast forward to the new standard in March 2026. The Supreme Court effectively comes in and says, actually, a pure income test for private and PSU employees just doesn't cut it legally anymore. So now the child of a private sector manager is looked at through the exact same status plus income lens as a government officer's child.
This right here is the absolute legal heart of the matter. This exact phrasing is pulled straight from the March 11th, 2026 Supreme Court judgment in the Government of India versus Rohit Nathan case. The court states, a candidate cannot be declared creamy layer solely on the basis of parent salary or income. Parental social status and position must also be weighed. By laying it out like this, the highest court in the country established that looking at income alone is just a flawed way to measure social advancement. The court essentially called out the old 2004 framework for treating government and private sector employees so differently. And look, for an aspirant, this isn't just dry legal jargon. Losing your reservation benefit, that can literally mean the difference between selection and total exclusion in an exam where a single mark dictates your future.
Moving on to part two, what changed in March and the massive push for exemption.
You know it's serious when the government panics. On August 25, 2026, the DOPT filed an incredibly urgent application in the Supreme Court. Why? Because from a purely systems perspective, changing the eligibility rules midstream creates a massive domino effect of failures down the line. The center basically threw up its hands and outlined 4 huge concerns. First off, avoiding total administrative chaos. I mean, think about it. Trying to re-verify the social status of tens of thousands of applicants overnight? Absolute nightmare. Second, preventing retrospective disputes. The government is terrified that thousands of certificates they've already issued and selections they've already made might get challenged in court by people who just missed the cut. Third, stopping a flood of litigation that could completely paralyze the recruitment machinery. And finally, the big one for candidates, protecting the UPSC 2025 and 2026 timelines. The center is basically begging the court for a 2-year buffer, a prospect of carve-out, so that candidates who relied on their existing certificates in totally good faith don't get disqualified after the fact.
Section 3. The constitutional framework and a quick legal history.
To fully grasp how we ended up in this massive bottleneck, we have to rewind the clock to 1992, to the landmark Indra Sawhney judgment. This is the moment the Supreme Court interpreted Article 16(4) of the Constitution to allow for reservations, but, and this is key, they simultaneously introduced this creamy layer filter as a fundamental requirement for equality. Fast forward a bit to 2004. The DOPT issues the executive orders that actually put this into practice, creating that dual system we talked about, status for government workers and pure income for the private sector. And honestly, that system just coasted along for over 20 years. That is, until March 2026, when the Supreme Court drops its ruling requiring status plus income across the board. Which brings us right up to August 2026, with the center filing its desperate exemption petition. We definitely didn't arrive at this chaos by accident, you know? It's the messy result of decades of evolving law trying to perfect a very imperfect system. So, what even is the creamy layer at its most basic level? Essentially, it's the principle that reservation is not just some permanent, forever entitlement for a family.
The logic here is that once a family climbs up and achieves a certain level of social and economic advantage, well, the next generation is expected to step up and compete in the open category. It's a way to ensure the reserved seats are actually going to those who are still genuinely disadvantaged. And it's absolutely crucial to point out here, the center in its August petition is not fighting the idea of the creamy layer. They completely agree with the philosophy. What they don't have, and what they are desperately asking the court for, are clear, functional rules on how exactly to measure a private citizen's position and social status without causing the entire administrative system to collapse.
All right, part 4, nuance and exceptions, because the devil is always in the details.
Let's clear up some major confusion right now, because there's been a lot of wild misinformation floating around. First up, OBCs versus SC/STs. The center just reiterated to the Supreme Court that creamy layer rules do absolutely not apply to SC/ST reservations. Let me repeat that. This current crisis is strictly an OBC non-creamy layer issue. Period. Next, central versus state lists. This one trips up so many people. The lists can and do differ. A certificate that works perfectly fine for your state-level exam, it does not automatically guarantee you're eligible for the UPSC, because UPSC uses the central list. And finally, looking at current versus future exams. Even if the Supreme Court throws the center a lifeline and exempts the 2025 and 2026 batches just to stop the chaos, future exams, meaning 2027 and beyond, are almost certainly going to be operating under this refined, much stricter status plus income test.
Now, stepping back from the strict legal jargon for a second, we really have to acknowledge what this actually feels like on the ground. When you take a hard, clean, objective number, like an 8 lakh rupee income limit, and you swap it out for some highly subjective assessment of social status and position, you are basically manufacturing mass anxiety. Families who are sitting just above or below that old income line are suddenly thrown into total limbo. Think about it. How does a random bureaucrat objectively measure the social status of, say, a freelance graphic designer versus a mid-level manager at a tech company? Subjectivity breeds anxiety for sure, but historically it also breeds a ton of litigation, and that is exactly the frustrating reality that candidates are living through today.
Section 5. What aspirants must do right now. Your action plan.
So, until the Supreme Court formally steps in to clarify things, that March 2026 ruling technically stands. Here is your 4-step survival guide to protect yourself. Step 1. Hoard your documents. Keep absolutely every single piece of paper that backed up your current non-creamy layer certificate. Income proofs, tax returns, your parents' employment records, old verification paperwork, everything. Keep physical copies, keep digital copies, just have it ready. Step 2. Keep your eyes glued to the Supreme Court listing for the DOPT application. The very first thing we're going to see drop is a short order saying yes or no to the UPSC exemption for the current exam cycles. Step 3. If you're targeting a later cycle, like 2027, you need to prepare for that dual test right now. Start figuring out how to document not just your family's income, but your parents' actual societal position and status. And step 4, and I literally cannot stress this enough, do not rely on random WhatsApp summaries or panicked social media rumors. The only thing that actually matters will be the court's final clarification order and the revised DOPT circular that will inevitably drop right after it. Which brings us to the million-dollar question we were all left with. If the Supreme Court does ultimately clarify that parental status and position absolutely must be assessed across the board from here on out, what specific documentary evidence is actually going to satisfy the DOPT and the UPSC for the 2027 cycle? How do you even prove a lack of status on a piece of paper? It is a massive administrative headache that the government still has to figure out. We're going to be watching the Supreme Court docket like a hawk. The second that clarification order is pronounced, we'll be right back here breaking down the exact operational test for you. So definitely subscribe to get that update immediately. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we will catch you in the next one.